All right, so throughout these lessons, I've been referring to the big five of computer hardware. And the big five components are the components that are necessary in order for you to have a computer even function. So we've learned about CPU. CPU processes all of our data. Motherboard. Motherboard connects everything together. The hard drive. Hard drive is needed for long-term data storage. RAM. RAM is needed for short-term data storage. So there's a fifth. So as we look in here, there's not a whole lot of components left, but if I'm just trying to move this out of the way, if we focus our attention right there, that is a pretty major component that isn't super exciting, but extremely necessary, and that's the power supply. Without the power supply, none of this would happen, because I've already talked about how the lifeblood of a computer is electricity, and the power supply is what supplies electricity to all of the different parts. So power supply is pretty easy to define. It supplies power. So just reverse the words. But basically the power supply is what is telling electrons to flow to the computer so that the computer can actually do useful things for us. So a couple little things. I want to talk about this. This here is what we call a Sata cable, S-A-T-A, and this is where information flows from one part of the computer to the other. So when I'm hooking up the hard drive, I'm using one of these. If I were to hook up some other CD-ROM, DVD drive, something like that, I would use one of these. Okay, but this is for data. Power is all of these other cords that make a mess of your computer, and these are actually what make computers hard to work on the inside because you have to avoid all of these cables. So the power supply plugs into the wall, electricity comes in, and then the electricity comes out. All of these cables goes into the motherboard and goes to other places like your hard drive and powers everything. So this is essential. Okay, it's kind of like the heart of the computer. There's your analogy. It's the heart of the computer. Without this, blood's not being pumped. Without this, electricity is not being pumped around the machine. So again, there's not too much to talk about with the power supply because it supplies power, but here's what one looks like out of the computer. So we have a giant fan. This is where the plug would go in, obviously, to the wall, and this is a giant fan that's going to get the heat out of there so that the power supply doesn't overheat and stop. And then inside, these cords, this is the massive amount of cords and all connectors for all the different things inside of your computer. I'm going to talk about those in 1 second. And then inside, you can kind of see there's stuff in there, but it's really heavily sealed. Like they don't want me in there. But I tried really hard for your sake, so I did open it up. And what you see inside of a power supply is stuff that you don't want to mess around with too much. There's capacitors and resistors and all that stuff you learned about in grade 9 science. And I just wanted to put this out there because this is, now we're getting down to the essentials of computer science. I don't want you to ever open up a power supply, but it is interesting that all that stuff you learned about in grade 9 science, resistors, capacitors, all that stuff in electricity, here's where it comes in handy. And so you can see all of those different parts in here, and it might look like a giant mess, but if you go into electrical engineering, this is kind of the stuff that you get into. It's kind of cool. And then here is the connector. So this giant connector here will connect to the motherboard. So it supplies power to the motherboard, and then the motherboard can send things different places. And then these ones here, so this little one here, I don't know how well you can see that, but that would power something like a hard drive, or like I said, a DVD-ROM or a CD-ROM or something like that. And there's multiples of those because most computers will have a few of those inside. Okay, so power supply supplies power. It's the heart of the computer, and without it, it's like you if you didn't have a heart that could pump blood.